So Genesis chapter 25 tonight. One of the weird things about life is when your grandparents, a lot of you have probably experienced your grandparents passing away, but it gets really bizarre when your grandparent who lost their spouse then decides that they need to go dating on the market. Now, usually, and this is statistically, they say that a person who loses a spouse that they really were in love with, a lot of times will die right after them, like within a couple of years. They just die, just of a broken heart or whatever. But every once in a while, they'll go shopping for a new spouse. And my grandfather did that. And so it was interesting because this last week, we got to spend some time with him because my step-grandmother, is that what it is? My step-grandmother was having surgery, so he was in town, so I thought it was important to let my kids spend some time with my grandfather anyway. But it's just hilarious to just see how they interact with each other, because he's 87, and he robbed the cradle. She's only in her 70s. So, he's anyway, what's funny is that he can't remember past 10 minutes. He's very sharp, but he just can't remember 10 minutes ago, and she's completely deaf. And so to watch, just them interact and the things that happen is just really funny to do. But that's kind of what we're looking at tonight, because if you recall, Sarah had passed away. She was 127 years old. We saw that in chapter 23. And she'd passed away. And so Abraham goes out on the market shopping for a new bride, and finds one, which is even more interesting. And it doesn't tell us how old she was or anything like that, but it would seem, because of the fruitfulness of their marriage in terms of children, she was probably pretty young. Just thinking about that. But so just to catch us up where we're at, remember that chapter 22 was kind of a pivotal chapter where Abraham took his son Isaac. And remember that God had given promises to him about Isaac, that he was going to be the heir. He was going to be the father of the multitude, that through his seed, Isaac, all the nations of the earth were going to be blessed. Now, Isaac, he's a bachelor still, probably in his 30s, maybe young 30. And of course, his mom died right after that at 27, which would have put him at 37 at that time. So he's a young 30-ish probably, and God speaks to Abraham, who is 130 almost, 137 about, or 130, and tells Abraham, this old man, take your son, your only son, to a place that I tell you, and offer him as a burnt sacrifice, which is insane. But Abraham is, at this point in his life, he's gotten used to the voice of God. He understands that God is faithful. He understands that he can trust God. And contrary to logic, here's my son. He's still living at home and he's 30. Not married, no children, not even a prospect of a bride, not even a child on the way. And God is telling me to kill him, to offer him as a burnt sacrifice. It's just contrary to logic. And you can imagine the prophet in the recesses of those crags as he's going 3 nights, 3 days journey, under the starlight, under the sun, wandering to the mountain of Moriah where he would offer his son. You can imagine him just trying to figure things out. And I think we do that as Christians, don't we? We're like, something goes wrong. We're like, okay, this is what God's doing. Okay, this must be what's going to happen. And that's exactly what Abraham did. He came to the conclusion there under the starlight one night, or during that journey, that God would rise his son from the dead. And that's what it tells us in the book of Hebrews, that Abraham by faith offered his son Isaac, believing that he was faithful, that he could even rise his son from the dead, which he did in a figurative sense. And so Isaac in this case becomes a very significant type of Christ, because Isaac being probably, let's just say he was 33, that's what I would speculate, just because it works. Him being 33 or so, and going to this mountain, which we know as Gordon's Calvary, or the place of the skull, or the place where Jesus was crucified, going to that very place, carrying the wood up the hill for the sacrifice, asking his dad, where's the sacrifice? He says, God will provide himself a lamb. And then getting up there, and as he's getting ready to, he binds his son, which we know as Isaac being a man, would have had to go willingly. And you can imagine that conversation that Abraham said, God has told me that you're the sacrifice, Isaac. What? But he's going to rise you from the dead. I figured it out. He's going to do it. Or whatever. And Isaac submitting himself to the Father, which is significant. Submitting himself to the Father to become the sacrifice. And then God, of course, through the angel saying, do not, kill your son, your only son. And then he hears this, I know you're not going to withhold anything from me, God tells him. And he says, you see this ram in the thicket. And he sacrifices it in his place. And then says, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. So significant. Jehovah Jireh, in the mountain, Lord, it will be provided, is what he said. It will be provided here in this spot. And it's almost as though he's seeing into the future, like God gives him a glimpse that 2,000 years later, on the very spot, God will send his own son walking up the hill with the sacrifice, the wood for the sacrifice, and then offer himself in that very place for the sins of mankind, an only son being submitted to the Father. Such a significant thing. Well, we saw that, but then we saw something that was also significant. Remember, Abraham came off the hill, but didn't come with he didn't come, it doesn't say. Remember at the beginning of chapter 22, he said, the lad and I will go yonder worship, which is what he was going to sacrifice him. He says, and we will come back to you. See, he had faith. We're going to come back to you. But what's bizarre is when you get to the end of the chapter, you don't hear, it just says Abraham returned and went with the young men, and it doesn't say anything about Isaac. Nothing about him. And then the next chapter, Sarah dies. Still doesn't mention anything about Isaac. Sarah dies. The loss of this woman of faith, the loss of, Isaac's mother. And she's gone off the scene. And it still doesn't mention Isaac. And then the next chapter, remember, it was Eliezer, unnamed, going to the place where Abraham was from to find a bride for his son. And isn't that amazing? Eliezer meaning the helper or the comforter. And him going to that place of Abraham's origin, his family, to redeem this woman, to basically bring her back for a bride for his son. And it's just such a beautiful picture of what the Holy Spirit does. The helper comes to convict the world of sin, righteousness, and judgment, to draw us to Jesus, to become a bride for him. And so we see in Rebekah a picture of the church. Jesus in Isaac, and Rebekah, a type we see of the church. And then it's interesting because now we see in this chapter not just Isaac and Rebekah coming together. And remember, that's the next time we saw Isaac, was him coming in the field as Rebekah's coming on the camel, and it tells us in the Hebrew that she fell off her camel. She was trying to put her veil on. She fell off her camel. And Isaac meets her. First impressions are everything. But he takes her, and it says, this is what's interesting. It says that he took her into his tent. She became his wife, and he was comforted about his mother's death, Sarah's death. And that's an interesting thing, and it's interesting as you see the typology there. You see Jesus coming into the world, and the Jews, the wife of Jehovah, if it will, dying in a sense, the Jewish system dying, if you will, a new covenant being born, and a new bride, which is the church, that comes from the Gentile world, and so it's such an interesting picture as we see this transition. And he's comforted from his mother's death, that as Jesus would be comforted from the rejection of his people by the birth of the church, or the new bride that he's gotten. So interesting as we look at the picture that we see here, but also taking it back to the original, that these are real people that God is using and working in their lives, and Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, and now Rebekah. And Abraham, he's hitting the scene in verse 1. It says, Abraham again took a wife, and her name was Keturah. And she bore to him Zimram, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, Shua, Jokshan begot Sheba and Dedan, and we maybe recognize some of these different nations as you study through the Bible. You'll see these different groups. The sons of Dedan were Ashurim, let us him. It's like let us him. Lemimim, and then the sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, Eldah. These were the children of Keturah. So you can probably mispronounce those as well as I can. But anyway, these, Abraham, he gets, his wife dies. He's thinking, I'm lonely, I need another wife. And so he goes and marries this woman and has all these kids with her. And then they have all these grandkids. And so it becomes very prolific. But notice verse 5. This is significant. So Abraham's remarried. He has these other kids. But remember that Abraham is well aware that the promises that God has given him, Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 15, that in his seed, singular, all the nations of the world will be blessed, that through Isaac the seed shall be called, to send away the bondwoman and her son. Remember that was painful. Send her away, and he sends her away. Ishmael being a type, if you will, of the flesh. It was Abraham's, his work. It was, and if you're not familiar with the story, if you haven't been with us or if you haven't read the book of Genesis, you should. But you remember that Hagar was Sarah's handmaiden, and when God told Abraham, hey, I'm going to make you fruitful, I'm going to give you children, and he's getting old. I mean, he's almost 90 at that time, and he's getting crusty. And Sarah's like, I'm dried up already. You just take my handmaid and just take this beautiful young Egyptian girl. And Abraham's answer should have been, oh no, honey, you're the only one for me. That should have been what he said. But what did he say? Okay. And so it ends up backfiring on him. And the implications of that sin, that one sin, just think about the implications of that one sin. What impact it has had on our world. Just the fallout that we've gotten because of that. Even to this day, you see the tension in the Middle East. You see the, Islam and Israel and the hatred, that is there. And it is almost as though these two nations still, fighting against each other. But anyway, it says, verse 5, notice this, and Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. Isn't that interesting? He gives everything to Isaac because he was the son of promise. He was the one whom God had appointed. He was the one whom God had blessed. And it's no different. Jesus is going to become the heir of all things, isn't he? And in that, everything will be put into subjection to him, and at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And no matter what we do with Jesus, we have to realize that he is everything. He is everything to the Christian. He is the only way to salvation. Of course, he said himself, I am the way, the truth, and life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. We know that it's only by faith in Jesus. It's not the works of righteousness that we do. It's not the hard effort. It's not the, hey, I belong to a church or I'm a good person. It is only because of him that we can be saved, and there is nothing in us that can earn it. There's nothing in us that can be worthy enough. We're broken. We are fallen. We are unworthy of the least of his mercies. And yet God, with his great love with which he loved us, gave his only Son that we who put our trust in him can be saved. And yet without that, there is no salvation. Without Jesus, without what he's done, there is no hope. And so he gives everything, just like God is going to give everything to Jesus. He gives everything to Isaac, But Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, and while he was still living, sent them eastward away from Isaac, his son, to the Isaac his son, to the country of the east. And so what Abraham did was, instead of giving them an inheritance within the land of promise, which was only for Isaac and his descendants, he sent them away, give them gifts, and sent them away to the east. Now, it says his concubines here, and that can be misunderstood, because you have to remember, really, if you could say Abraham had a concubine, it was Hagar. He took her as a wife because of Sarah. Sarah wanted him to. But Keturah was his second wife after his wife had passed away. And so Abraham didn't, he wasn't multiplying wives to himself or anything like that. You don't get that idea with Abraham. But he definitely was very fruitful, more fruitful in his older age than he was in his young age. And we see here, it says, verse 7, this is the sum of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 175 years. So his wife, Sarah, only lived till she was in her 20s, right? 120s. She lived to 127. But Abraham lived to 175, so much longer than Sarah. And we're not sure exactly why. I think that it's an interesting thing as we look at life, and we know, all of us probably know people who are very young who have passed away, and we know people that are old, really old, that pass away, and yet that's just the way that life is. And I think that this is something that we all have to. We face this. We face death, we face illness, we face sickness, we face problems in our life. And it's something that we have to realize is that God's plan and God's purpose isn't to make your life comfortable and wonderful on this earth. It is that you would have abundant life, but not because of the overabundance of earthly possessions or health, wealth, or prosperity. And sometimes God does do that in people's lives. But just as generously, God blesses other people who are very poor and very short-lived with even more in spiritual things or in fulfillment and satisfaction in life. And honestly, when it comes to life, it doesn't matter what we have or what we don't have. The only thing that's important to have is Jesus, right? Because in eternity, we're not going to care how big a house we had or what great a job we worked or what our education was. None of those things are going to matter in the scope of eternity. In the scope of eternity, it's going to be how close are we to Jesus. And God is wise. He knows, and you know this in your own life, even though you don't like it. He knows that the pain that you went through when that thing happened was something that drove you closer to Him oftentimes, right? Or at least broke you down or showed you who you really were. Because oftentimes life goes very wrong from the perspective of what would be good as being a human, but it's very right in terms of our eternity. And we can't measure our life by the abundance of blessings on this earth, but more so on the abundance of blessings in knowing Jesus. As Jeremiah says, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, or the mighty man glory in his might, or the strong man, or whatever it is. I don't know. The three things he says. Can't remember the third one, but whatever it is. But he says, let him who glories glory in this, that he understand and knows me, that I am the Lord. And that is what life is about, is knowing Jesus. And nothing more. And everything else is details. And yeah, we get excited when something good happens for us. That's awesome. We get really depressed when something bad happens for us. But let all those things drive us to Jesus. Because oftentimes when good things happen, we forget about God, don't we? When it's just going smooth and everything's wonderful and hey, life's roses and I got a great job, I got a good family, everything's wonderful, I just don't pray. Why pray? God whispers to us in our pleasure, but He screams to us in our pain, doesn't He? And so Abraham living a long life, Sarah living a shorter life, but God had his purpose for both. And honestly, why did he take Sarah before he took Abraham? Maybe because he loved her more? I don't know. But she got to be with Jesus quicker, right? But it says, verse 8, and Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man full of years, and was gathered to his people. And so that's significant. Abraham lived a long life, and it was a fruitful life, and it was a good life. And if you think of any life that anybody lived, Abraham was definitely blessed in every way. And yet, as Tozer would say, A.W. Tozer said, that Abraham, though he was a rich man, he possessed nothing. It was God that he was following hard after, and not after the things that life could offer him. Because the one thing that was important to him, that was his son. Remember when he said to God, "What are you going to give me, seeing that I'm old and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus, not even my own son?" His interest was in his son, and then he would be willing to give that up to God as a sacrifice. That's how dedicated to God he was. And so Abraham knew God to be faithful, and he knew God. And he was gathered to his people. Now we see a glimpse of this. This is significant. In Luke chapter 16, if you're reading through Luke chapter 16, Jesus tells this really bizarre story about two people who were, living close to each other. This rich man who lived in a nice house and fared sumptuously every day and had all these luxuries, and this poor beggar that lived outside of his gate that just would hope to get some scraps, from this rich man's table. But it would seem the rich man didn't care about the beggar. But the beggar was a believer and the rich man was not. And so they both died, and they both went to Sheol, the grave, this place where people went when they died at that time. And so on one side, this rich man is in torment, it tells us, desiring even a drop of water that might be put on his tongue, by Lazarus. And Lazarus was being comforted with his head on Abraham's chest. He was just comforting him. And he looks across and he says, "Hey, Father Abraham, help me," or, "Send Lazarus back from the dead." And Abraham said, "Hey, even if somebody raises from the dead, they still won't believe. They have Moses and the prophets. Let them believe them." And so this whole story. But you see Abraham there why I tell that story is because you see Abraham here in this place of paradise, comforting those, his children, who come by faith in the promise of the Messiah that was to come to be with him in that place. And that's where Abraham was. And so it says he's gathered to his people. Abraham wasn't dead, right? And Jesus made that point to the Pharisees. God said, or the Sadducees rather, he says, God said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God is the God of the living and not of the dead, right? And so Abraham doesn't die, but he goes to this place waiting. Now this is an interesting thing, and a lot of people get confused about this because of, Milton and Dante, who wrote books about, the afterlife and things like that. We get really confused, and we just think, good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell, or Christians go to heaven and non-believers go to hell. It's not quite that simple, and it hasn't always been quite that simple. So back then, in Abraham's time, they were gathered to their people. They went to paradise. Remember, Jesus said to the thief on the cross, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Not heaven, but Abraham's place, right? That's where he was going to be with him, not in heaven. Jesus said in John chapter 3, verse 13, "No man has ascended to the Father except the Son of Man. No man has ever ascended to heaven except for the Son of Man who is in heaven," right? And has come down from heaven and who is in heaven. And so Jesus basically says, I'm the only one that's ever come from heaven, and I'm the only one that's ever gone to heaven. Nobody has ever been there. Well, how could he say that? If when they die, where do they go? Well, back then, everybody went to the same place. There was the torment side, and there was the paradise side. When Jesus died on the cross and paid for the sins of the world, he not only paid for future people, but he paid for all the people who believed in by faith in the Messiah, the promise of the Messiah, all the way back to Adam. And so they were waiting by faith to be resurrected. And when Jesus went down, those people went with him, and heaven began to be populated. Why? Because he had paid for their sins. So now, there's nobody in that place. Paul tells us twice, twice he says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. You know, this whole idea of soul sleep, that you're going to lay in the grave for 2,000 years. No, it's not biblical. Because Paul said to be absent with the body is to be present with the Lord. He also said, it is far better for me, he told the Philippians, it's far better for me to depart and to be with Christ, but it is more needful for me to be with you. We didn't say, oh, it'd be far better for me to just lay in the ground for 2,000 years and wait for Jesus to come back. No, he says it'd be far better for me to die and be with Christ, but for you it's more needful that I stay, that I don't die yet. And so this idea that we're going to be in the grave is not entirely true. Now, what does it talk about those who sleep in the earth? Well, this is what it's talking about, those who sleep in Jesus. This is what it's talking about. When Jesus comes back, it tells us in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, it talks about the rapture of the church. He said that the dead in Christ will rise first, but he says that God will bring them with him. Okay, so how does that work? How do they rise first and God bring them with him? Well, they're in heaven right now, but they have spiritual bodies. When Jesus comes back, he's going to bring those people with him in their spiritual bodies, and their physical bodies will be resurrected from the grave. And if you go to the graveyard, you see everybody's laying there, facing east, so that when Jesus comes back, they can stand up straight and not be backwards. Right? I'm not kidding. That's what they do. They bury you facing a certain direction. It's true. And so when Jesus comes back, you can, be resurrected from the grave, and you'll see him face to face. And those who are alive and remain, the Christians, will be caught up to be with the Lord. Now, what the Bible tells us is that in an instant, in the moment, in the twinkling of an eye, our mortal bodies will become immortal. Our chunky bodies will become slim. It's going to all happen in the moment of a twinkling eye. Our issues will all go away. Everything that's not good. All have more hair. All that. But we're going to be changed, and so it would seem that our physical bodies, and it doesn't matter. So, okay, you're cremated. Jesus can find the dust, right? Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. People become dust anyway. Cremation just makes it happen faster, right? There's still fragments of you in this earth that will be resurrected and become whatever, So don't let people freak you out about that. Anyway, we've digressed. Abraham dies. Now he's in the grave. He's gathered to his people. That's significant. Verse 9, and his son Isaac and Ishmael. Now this is interesting. So Isaac's, he's 40 now, or actually no, he's 65. Or 75 when this happens. And so this is not all in chronological order. We're going to notice that. Isaac, he's 75 years old. He gets together with his brother Ishmael, who's in his 80s. They get together. They bury Abraham in the cave of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar, the Hittite. The field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth, there Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. So that was significant. Abraham believed that God was going to give him the land of promise. Abraham purchased his grave to bury Sarah, remember that, from the sons of Heth, in the land of promise, and he would be buried there as well. In a sense, laying claim by faith that God was going to give his descendants that land. And so verse 11, it says, it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt in Beer Lahairoi. Now, whenever you live too close to Beer, it's not necessarily a good thing, right? this is an interesting place. Think about this. Where do we get Bir Lahairoi? We get it from Hagar. Remember that? Sarah was mean to her. As girls can be mean to each other, especially when there's competition over a guy. Sarah, Hagar was kind of shooting, stink eye towards Sarah and her son, and because she was, having a baby or whatever, and so Sarah felt threatened. She tells Abraham, and Abraham, says, "Do with her what you want." So she basically abuses her, and she runs away. Remember that? Hagar runs away. She goes out into the wilderness, and God shows up, right? And he says, "Hey, go back and submit yourself to your I've seen your affliction. I'm going to bless your child. Go back and submit to Sarah." And so she goes back, but she names the place the God who sees. Now, that's significant because this place is a place that recognizes that God is the one who sees. He sees what's going on in our lives. He understands our problems. He understands our hurts. He understands when we've been treated poorly. But this is on the edge of the land of Israel heading towards Egypt. She was running back home. And so he decides to make his home on the edge, right? And some Christians do that, don't we? We like to live on the edge. And you always wonder, when a young man comes to me and says, "So, how far is too far?" When you ask the question, that's how far was too far, right? If you want to be, I just want to be right on the edge. I don't want to go over to sin, but I just want to be looking at it and smelling it, because I just want to be real close to me, right? No, too far. If you're asking that question, you've gone too far, right? Because your desire should be for the Lord, to live in the middle of the land, to be right in the middle of God's will. But Isaac moves his house to the edge of God's will, and you're going to see that that's going to be a problem for him. Now, don't get me wrong, because Isaac was a believer. We saw that as he's coming out to pray. He was at Bir Lahairoi praying when his wife Rebekah came, and so he sees her, and that's when they're married or whatever. But that's where he's living. Now, verse 12, it says, "Now this is the genealogy of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's maidservant, bore to him. And these were the names of the sons of Ishmael by their names according to their generation. The firstborn of Ishmael was Nebajoth." I'm not even sure how to pronounce that. And then Kedar. Now, Kedar, you'll probably recognize that in the news. Kedar are the people who live in Kuwait. Remember, and of course, Saddam Hussein claimed to be a descendant of Kedar, and of course, Muhammad himself was a descendant of Kedar. And so that's significant because we see these Ishmael. Think about that. Muhammad comes from Kedar, and if Abraham would have never taken Hagar and Ishmael never would have been born, then Muhammad never would have been born. And how would the world look today if Islam was not, taking over the whole Middle East? It's an interesting thing. But anyway, so Kedar, Adabel, Mibsam, Mishma, Dama, Massa, Hadar, Tema, Jedur, Naphish, and Kedemath. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these were their names. I'm not good at those, by the way, so don't say, "Oh, that's how Pastor Mike said it's pronounced." I'm just shooting in the dark here. By their towns and their settlements, 12 princes according to their nations. These were the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he breathed his last and died. Now, notice the contrast between Abraham's description of his death, at a good old age, kind of a blessed life. It just says that he lived 137 years and breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. They dwelt from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. As you go towards Assyria, he died. It's interesting, the word here, died, is not the same word that's used when it talks about Abraham dying, but it basically, the word means to fall down dead. And so it says he fell down in the presence of his brethren. It's kind of an interesting thing. Part of the blessing on him is that he would dwell in the presence of his brethren, and now he falls down in the presence of his brethren. Now, this is interesting because it also says he was gathered to his people. And so we don't know exactly what that means, but we hope that it means that Ishmael himself was a believer. His mother seemed to be. She believed in God, and she, remember she said, "You're the God who sees." And so she seemed to have a relationship with God. But whether or not Ishmael picked that up is difficult to know. Hopefully he was gathered to the right side and not the left side or the wrong side or whatever, right? Verse 19, this is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. And so Abraham would have his genealogy pass through Isaac, which would become the line of promise that he would bear Jacob, and Jacob would bear the 12 tribes of Israel. And so if you've never put that together, that's where that comes from. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padan Aram, and the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah his wife conceived. Now this is interesting. So he marries her. She was extremely beautiful. We learned that from Eliezer. She was the joy of Isaac's life. When he saw her, he loved her instantly. He married her. He was comforted by her. But with all that, she was unable to conceive. Now I know a little bit about this because my wife and I kind of had the same circumstance. We were unable to conceive. And I love what it says here because I think that this is something that's neglected today. And that is when Isaac sees that his wife that he loves is barren, what does he do for her? He prays for her. And I think that this is okay, guys, if you are a man here today and you are married, or you plan on being married someday, this is the key to successful marriage for a man. The Bible tells you, men, dwell with your wives with understanding. How many men understand your wives? So you got it down. She's easy to read. No takers? Really? Why? No, it is a very complex thing. And God has fearfully and wonderfully made our wives. He has made them very difficult to understand. My wife will admit I don't even understand myself sometimes, right? And that's just part of being a woman. They feel a lot more than men feel. And so here's a man who is in a very difficult situation. His wife is pregnant, or she's not getting pregnant. They're trying to get pregnant, and she's not able to get pregnant. And so what does he do for her? Does he get bitter towards her? Why do you keep complaining to me? No, he prays for her. And this is the key to successful marriage, guys. Because I believe that no successful marriage is a horizontal marriage. It has to be vertical. It has to be me to God and her to God, right? I always tell the guys that, that illustration about the car. You're driving down the Autobahn in a Ferrari, and all of a sudden it starts making noises, and you pull off to the side, and you go to the front, and you open the front to see what's wrong, and there's a tire there. So you close that, you go to the back, you open up the back, and there's this marvel of Italian engineering staring at you, and it's smoking. And what do? Do you start monkeying with that? I ask guys that. Do you monkey with that? You stick your hands in there? And every guy has always said, no way. Only a fool would touch that. Only a fool knows. I mean, yeah, I'd like to understand how that works, but I don't get it. It is a marvel of engineering, and a mechanic who is specially trained the manufacturer should only mess with that. And so what do? You call the manufacturer. It's the same way. She's fearfully and wonderfully made with pistons and gears and whatever that you don't understand. Systems working there that are highly tuned that you don't understand. And so how do you deal with that disconnect where I don't understand? I mean, I pushed this button and she started making this noise and I don't know what to do, You call the manufacturer, right? You just say, hey, I don't get it. How do you fix this? This is the awesome thing is it's almost like God, and I've done this, I've prayed for my wife a lot over the years. We've been married for 20 years in April. And so know a little bit about marriage. And it started out really rough. I didn't know how to use the clutch. I didn't know how to get it in gear right. I mean, it was pretty rough ride at the beginning. But then I began to talk to God about my wife. And what is amazing to me is that there were times when I was so irritated with her, when I thought she was such a big problem at times, that I would complain to God about her, and things would change, but he never let me see them change on her side. He just showed me things to do differently. He showed me how to drive, right? Just continue the illustration. He showed me how to drive in a way that wasn't going to grind her gears. And pretty soon she started changing, but it seemed to only be in response to what he did in my heart. I never had this benefit of saying, okay, fix her, and I got to see him fix her, because it never worked that way. It always worked with, well, let me just talk to you about you. And I complain, and he say, okay, let me talk to you about you. And he began to change me. And that made marriage good. And I began to understand, okay, you know what? She needs to, I need to be easy on the clutch. I need to be, smooth on the shifting. I can't rev it up. I can't spin the corner. I have to drive this thing with respect, right? And so, the women are like, what in the world are you talking about? The men know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Hopefully I'm speaking your language. But it comes down to talking to the Lord. And this is what he does for his wife. And I think this is so good. She has a problem. And men, this is why it's so hard. You want to fix it. This is what's going on in my life. Okay, well, you got to do this and this and this and this. And she's like, you don't understand. And she runs away. And you're like, you're crazy. Didn't help, right? Doesn't help. You have to realize that God has created her to be more complex than you, but in a beautiful way. And so you have to be constantly in conversation with him to be able to make your marriage work. And I believe that Jesus is the key to successful marriage. Without Jesus, there's no way you can figure it out. There's no way you can figure it out. And so your relationship with your wife or even your husband, this works backwards for women too. I always tell the women, you're driving down a country road in a truck and it starts to sputter and spark and it breaks down, you pull over to the side. Do you mess with that truck? It's simple, but you still don't want to mess with it, right? You don't want to get dirty. You let the mechanic handle it, right? It's the same thing. You call the manufacturer. He seems so simple, but he's such a mess. Lord, help me. Help me figure this dope out, and God gives you wisdom to be the spouse you need to be. And that's what Isaac is being for his wife. He is being the spouse he needs to be by praying for her. And so he goes to God. It says, what verse did we read last? Do you guys know? Verse 21? 22. No, we didn't go that far. Okay, we read verse 21. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife. So he prays for her because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. That's how my wife got pregnant. We were barren for 10 years. I prayed and prayed for God to do something, and God did. He healed my wife's womb. A miraculous story, but that's how Isaiah came into the world. Anyway, I'll tell you sometime if you haven't heard it. Verse 22, but the children struggled together within her, and she said, if all is well, why am I like this? So I'm guessing she said this to Isaac, and hopefully Isaac didn't answer that question. Just let that one go. Why am I like this? But I love this because it says, so she went to inquire of the Lord. So she had the same thing. I need to go to the Lord because I don't understand this. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Oh, that's complex. So you have two nations struggling in your womb. Can you imagine? You got the Arabs on this side and you got the Israelis on this side. You got Middle East conflict happening indigestion style. And she's having, these people have never gotten along. Even in the womb, there has been tension. Isn't that crazy? But her birth was prophetic of what was to come. And this is amazing. God gives this, two people, or that you're having twins. This is the first occurrence of twins in the Old Testament that we see. Not that it's the first time it ever happened, but it's the first one we see. And one is going to be stronger than the other, but the older shall serve the younger. Isn't that interesting? God says, when they aren't even born yet, the little one is going to be more powerful than the older one. That the older one is going to serve the younger. And Paul makes his case about election in Romans chapter 9, when he says that when they had done neither good or evil, God determined it to be so, according to the law of election. And, of course, this sparks the Calvinism and Arminian conflict, in the world. And I want to simplify this for you because it isn't all that complicated. I think, these theologians think they're so smart. But it's no different than the question as this: how come I was born in a Christian family and somebody else wasn't? Did God love me more than them? And really, that's the question that comes to our mind is, how come this person seems blessed in their life and this person doesn't seem blessed? How come this one was born to privilege and this one wasn't? And yet, the answer to the question, and this is what Paul is trying to get at Romans 9, not trying to say, well, Calvinism is the way or whatever, and then in other chapters, Arminianism is the way. I think both of those go to extremes that are harmful. But what he's saying is, God is sovereign. He's in control, and it all comes down to faith. Those who are elected, who are chosen by God, the Jews, aren't going to be saved unless they believe by faith. And yet a Gentile who was born outside of the Commonwealth of Israel, if he believes by faith, he will be saved. And it all comes down to our relationship with God. That's what this whole thing is about. And God knew when he saw Ishmael and Isaac, he knew what the product was going to be because God sees from beginning to end. He knew what these boys were going to become. He understood the characters that they'd had and all of that. So, verse 24, so when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red. Not uncommon probably with birth, but he was hairy and red. He was like a hairy garment all over, so they called his name Esau, which means hairy. They called him hairy. He's like he came out, he's wearing a cardigan sweater. He's hairy dude. Verse 26, after his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Heel Catcher, or Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So he waited 20 years. This is significant because he is 60 years old. That means Abraham is 160. Abraham dies at 175. And so these boys were 15 years old when Abraham died. Now, we don't put that together because the chapter isn't in chronological order. So these guys are born, even though we've just talked about Abraham's death, it hasn't happened yet. It was it was telling us about Abraham, then Ishmael, and now it's talking about Isaac, but it kind of backed up. So Abraham is still alive when these kids are born, and he'll be alive for 15 years. So these guys, no doubt, are raised on Abraham's knee and instructed as young men by Abraham and told what the privilege of being born in this family is all about, right? They know what the birthright is. They understand what the privilege of being the heir in this family is. Even if Isaac wasn't a good father, definitely Abraham would have been. It says, so the boys grew, and Esau was skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man. The word in the Hebrew actually is perfect. Translated perfect 15 times. When it talks about Job being upright, same word. Mild man, I don't know. It's the only place it's translated that way, so it's interesting. But Jacob was a mild man dwelling in tents. I think the King James says plain. But verse 28, and Isaac loved Esau because he ate his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And so we see here favoritism amongst the parents for the kids. I love this kid because he brings me some good meat. He really knows how to bring home the bacon. And Rebekah is like, this is the promised child. This is the blessed one that God told me was going to rule over his brother. And so she loved Jacob for the spiritual aspect probably. It says, now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was very weary. And Esau said to Jacob, please feed me with some of that red stew, for I am weary. Therefore his name was called Edom, Edom meaning red. So the people of Edom were the descendants of Esau. But Jacob said, sell me your birthright as of this day. And Esau said, look, I am about to die, so what is my birthright to me? Then Jacob said, swear to me as this day. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Wow. If you think about it, here's Rebekah. Now remember, let's go back to our typology. She's the type of the church. In her is a struggle between the spirit and the flesh. Does this sound familiar to you? This struggle of, I want to do this, I want to do right, but I just don't seem to be able to do it. I was on a diet, but then I came to this potluck. I mean, it's just that whole thing of I have this war. Have you ever had an argument with yourself? Yes. I'm not going to do that. No. And you just fight. And that's what the Christian life is. It's a fight between the flesh and the spirit. And yet, which one's going to win? That's the big question, isn't it? It's like this guy. He used to fight he had these two dogs, and he'd have these big fights, and everybody would come to watch his dogs fight. He had a black dog and a white dog, and they'd fight each other. And the guy would, take wagers and stuff on the dogs, but he'd always put his own wager on the dogs, and he always won. And they said, how do you know which dog's going to win? And he confided in somebody one day. He says, I know the dog's going to win because that's the dog I fed. Think about that. If you feed your spirit's going to win, but if you feed your flesh is going to win. And that's such a practical way to look at it when it comes to our life in Christ. And so she has these two nations warring within her. We have that war as well. And Esau is very much the sensual, earthy, I want what I want and I'm going to get it right now. How many people make a decision in an instant that ruins their life? Now, I'm a foster parent. I know all about it. I get kids in my home, and their parents have gone down a road, and it was one moment where they took a hit off that crack, or they took smoked or took that meth. I don't even know how to take meth, but they took it, and it ruined their life. One moment, and that can be it. And so we see Esau, and he says, I don't give a rip about my birthright. What was his birthright? That he would be the heir of many nations, that he would be, through him, all the nations of the earth would be blessed, that the Messiah was going to come through him, and he sold it for a bowl of soup. How many people sell out Jesus for just the tantalization of the flesh? I would come to Jesus, but I just don't want to give up this. How often does that happen in somebody's life? It's so common. And yet, Jacob loved it. He wanted to be the one who the Messiah would come through. Jacob was a believer. Esau was a profane man, and he did not believe, he didn't care. And so when you see statements, and this is another one, it talks about this in Romans chapter 9 too, but in Malachi it says, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. How could God say that? He hates this kid? No, God hates what Esau represents, which is unbelief. Jacob, by faith, knowing that what this promise was all about was something he wanted to be the heir of. I want the Messiah to come through my line. I want Jesus. And he grabbed hold of it. Even though he was tricky about it, he grabbed hold of it, where Esau rejected it. And so too it is for you and for me. You know, am I going to live for Jesus, or am I going to live for the flesh? And that's the big question that we have to ask ourselves when we think about this story, because God wants us to live by faith in Him and not by the strength of our flesh or the pleasures of sin for a season. Let's pray.